What a man. What a life, what a leader, what a gift you are to America. Let me call up my dear friend and my personal hero, Lonnie Bunch. Come on up, let's talk. I didn't want to talk too much at the podium because I wanted us to get to this conversation. Lonnie, we're here tonight to celebrate you. We reap the dividends of your leadership. Our children will reap the dividends of your leadership. My husband is in the audience, and Broderick Johnson, and we just became grandparents. And we talk about how we're going to raise a museum kid. We're not raising him, he's our grandchild, but but you know how you get provident about your grandchildren. And we can't wait to let him experience all that you have offered us. Thank you so very much for what you do.
Well, I can't thank you enough, but I have one question. You don't think I'm Ralph Bunch, do you? I got to tell you how humbled I am. And if you don't know who Ralph Bunch is, you're of a certain age. I just probably can't tell you. But this means so much to me. I didn't know what to expect, and I'm very emotional to have so many good friends here, to have my wife, to have my daughter, who is much smarter than I'll ever be, here, and to be able to sort of recognize that what you're doing is helping us all remember the power, the importance of history. And so while I may be getting this award, what you're really doing is reminding a country how strong it is when it embraces the totality of its past, and how much we learn from our past, because that past not only contextualizes today, but it really points us towards a better shared future. So I'm humbled, honored, and I might even cry. So I'm really touched by this.
And that's okay if you do. You're among friends. So let's talk.
Okay.
We're going to talk about your journey, and let's, by the way, in preparing for this, people in the reception kept pulling me aside. You have mentors all over the place, pulling me aside and telling me about how you changed their life. But let's go back to the beginnings. You grew up, as we heard, in New Jersey. I'm told by your daughter that your off-hours uniform is usually a New Jersey T-shirt of some kind and a pair of jeans. See, people were telling on you before we came up here. So can you tell us a little bit about what happened to you as a young boy in New Jersey that now you recognize set the path? Because often those things that happen to us early in life, they plant seeds, and we realize that, wow, this is why I do what I do.
Yep.
This is why I see the way I see. This is why I see around corners, because of something that happened. Was there anything in particular that you want to mention?
I think there were two moments. One is my grandfather died the day before I turned 5, so I was very young. And he used to take me into the basement and he'd read books. And one day he pulled out a book and it had pictures, he said, of school children. And the picture was, 90 years old. And he said to me that the kids in this picture are probably no longer with us. And then he read the caption. He said, underneath it said, unidentified children. And he said something I'll never forget. He said, isn't it a shame people could live their lives, die, and all this is unidentified? And so I always wanted to know what people's lives were like. I'd look at photographs and say, were they happy? Were they treated fairly? And so that really began my interest. But it really became because of the neighborhood I grew up in. There were people that treated me wonderfully and people that treated me unbelievably horrible. I always think of the story that I was playing basketball in the backyard with a bunch of kids, and the mother came out and she gave everybody Kool-Aid until she saw me and said, you drink out of the hose. And I'll never forget that pain. And I remember thinking, I've got to try to understand why people treat people like that. And for me, history was really my opportunity to understand first about the little town I grew in, but then it was really about how do I understand America? How America has grappled with race, how America has grappled with fairness and unfairness. So really, growing up in that neighborhood, I always say New Jersey taught me 3 very valuable things. It taught me when to run, how to fight, and how to talk your way out of something. And that's really shaped my entire career.
That sounds like New Jersey. No offense to people from New Jersey in the audience, but.
Right.
So how much of your history did your own family talk about? Your people come from North Carolina. Your father was educated as a dentist twice, really. Because, grandfather, excuse me, was educated as a dentist twice because in America he had to keep getting paper so he could practice his craft. He could use his skills. How much of that was talked about in your house?
Never. We never talked about history of family. Partly it was because when my father was born, his father was 52 years old. So there was such a gap that there weren't conversations about that. My grandparents both died before I turned 5, so there really wasn't that history. It was something that I discovered years later. And even when we went to my mother's family, which was in North Carolina, in those days you went down once a year. And you really didn't talk to anybody. You sort of sat around the table and talked to kids and recognized that they had accents and you didn't. And so I think that it really wasn't something I even thought about candidly until about 20 years ago. My father's only sister had died and my father was depressed, and I said, let's come to the National Archives and see what we could find out. So in those days, the microfilm reader, and we found out his grandfather and other things, and that got me excited about thinking I need to know about myself. And then ultimately, having kids and then grandkids, you suddenly realize the only gift you really give them is an understanding of who they once were and who they can become.
But isn't it interesting that in many African American households, that history is part of our wealth, but we don't give our children, our next generation, that inheritance? That was my experience in my family also. I wrote a book called The Grace of Silence because my family didn't talk about things. I think part of the reason was the pain.
Yes.
Was just so deep that the previous generations didn't want to weigh us down.
That's right.
They wanted us to soar. Is that part of what you're doing through your work now, is helping people recognize that historical wealth is something that must be talked about so it can be inherited and embraced?
I think that for me, what's so important is to recognize there is no reason to run from your history, that we all have histories that we can dip into, that it's an amazing reservoir. When I look for inspiration, I look for Frederick Douglass or, but what I really do is suddenly realize about my grandmother, who took in other people's laundry, who scrubbed other people's floors so her children and grandchildren wouldn't have to work on bended knee. So for me, it was, how do I let people understand that these stories are really the story of who we can become because we're standing on those shoulders. So for me, it's really about the inspiration I take from my own family as well as from the broader figures of history.
So what was a young Lonnie Bunch like? If we encountered you in junior high, what would we see?
You'd see somebody that thought the key to life was playing second base for the Yankees. I knew that was going to happen. But you found somebody who was trying to figure out how do you become successful as a black kid in a white world, and trying to figure out how do you read the room, how do you know when you're in trouble, how do you know when to move forward, and and by the time I was in middle school, the key was for me is that I realized that the key to my success was education. I tell my daughters all the time, they're the 4th generation of Bunches to graduate college. So in my family, that was the key to your success. So suddenly, as an 8th grader, I was told by my father, now it's time to get serious and buckle down, or else, as he used to say, you'll sweep a floor for the rest of your life. I didn't realize that when I built the museum, I'd have to sweep the floor anyway.
So you keep talking about how in New Jersey you learned how to spot danger. Yeah. You learned how to figure out when to run. I'm told by some of your friends that I should ask you about your encounter with a certain group of Italians in New Jersey.
I grew up in an Italian neighborhood, so I grew up speaking Sicilian. I can only curse in it now, but I think that what was important to me was recognizing that Many of these people became friends for life. When I was building the African American Museum, a friend called me and said, "Hey, Lonnie, you need concrete?" So when I say I know people who know people, believe me. But I think what it taught me was difference. By being able to recognize that there was a difference if you were Sicilian or if you were Napolitan, it helped me understand that it was okay to understand differences and to embrace that. And for me, it taught me how to sort of survive in the world more than anything else. Whereas the story we were told from my grandfather, when he graduated college, wanted to be a dentist and didn't have the money. So he went to Atlantic City, and in those days, this is 1910, 1911, they would hire college-educated black men to push people in the rolling chairs. The elite would be in the rolling chairs on the boardwalk. And so according to family lore, he once said that he pushed around more white people than Stokely Carmichael. Now, I don't know if that's true, but that gave us this sense of, you have to also be able to handle yourself no matter where you are.
So as a young person, you were heading in another direction. We heard about that fateful meeting that you went to at the National Air and Space Museum. What did you intend to do? What happened in that meeting that changed your path? And did you walk into there knowing that you were going to, I'm not going to say shake things up, but change things, move the chairs around, change the way they did business? Or did you recognize that once you actually got inside the building and the institution?
I just always wanted to be a historian. I thought, well, historian, you're teaching the academy. And I was finishing up graduate school here in Washington, and I was broke. And there was a returning student. She was probably 40. She seemed so old. And she said to me, you should go talk to the Smithsonian about a job. She said her husband worked at the Smithsonian. And I remember saying to her, who the hell works at the Smithsonian? It's where you take dates because it's free. I mean, that was my notion of the Smithsonian. So I go down, and they introduced me to the head of the Smithsonian. Now, I'm not going to get a job. I got a big afro. I've got an Army officer's jacket on that says Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club on one sleeve and Black Magic on the other, so I'm not going to get a job. So I'm just chatting away, and the secretary, after 3 hours, says, we'd like to hire you. And I said, come on.
3 hours?
3 hours. I'm like, I said, come on, you're going to hire me? And I said, well, I don't mind working in American history. And he said, no, we don't have any jobs here. We only have a job at the Air and Space Museum. And I said, I'm a 19th century historian. I don't like airplanes. I'm not interested in space. I don't want to do this. And he gave me the best lesson I ever had. He gave me that, young man, how much money are you making now? I said, $300 a month. He said, you become a curator at Air and Space, you'll make 4 times that. I'm a curator at Air and Space. That changed the trajectory of my career.
So what did you first do when you got there?
I was half historian, half educator. And so I really wanted to sort of think about how the Smithsonian paid attention to Washington, D.C., how it worked with the school systems, et cetera. But the most important thing that happened to me at Air and Space was I was getting ready to go on a trip, and somebody said, oh, there's a new intern. Have you met the new intern? I said, no, I'm a scholar. I don't got time for any interns. So I went away, and when I came back, I walked a different way to my office. I said, who is this woman? Turned out to be the woman I married. So that to me was Air and Space.
Fortuitous for all of us.
Absolutely.
When you were at Air and Space, you were starting to research interesting things and introducing that into the overall programming. The Tuskegee Airmen that we know a lot about, the crop dusters that we don't know as much about. How did you take that information and then encourage them to work that into the program? Because that was not a history that was well understood or well told at that point.
What I realized is that I couldn't compete with some of those folks who are experts on, this plane or that area, but I realized that I could help them look at issues of race and gender and how it shaped aviation. And so I began to work on first the Tuskegee Airmen, the great fighter pilots of World War II, but then as I interviewed some of the Tuskegee Airmen, they talked about these earlier barnstormers, black men and women who flew in the 20s and 30s, and that was their inspiration. So I began to look at those folks and go around the country and interview them and begin to tell those stories. And what happened is it wasn't sort of me saying, you've got to tell these stories. What happened was Senator Ted Kennedy actually went to the Air and Space Museum and said, I don't see anything but people who look like me. And you know, one of the joys of the Smithsonian is if Congress prods you, you can do something. And so basically they then said, do you have any ideas? I said, boy, do I have ideas. And ultimately it led us to doing more on the Tuskegee Airmen and more on early aviation and more on women's roles in aviation. And so I think that it taught me that I could take a good idea and try to make it work.
So you mentioned something that the audience might not know about. Can you just say a word about the Barnstormers?
Sure. There were, beginning really with Bessie Coleman right after World War I, you had black pilots who realized that aviation was considered so special that only certain people can do it. And the belief was that if black men and women could fly as high and as fast as white pilots, then equality would follow on the ground. So this was really an opportunity to prove that blacks were worthy of equality. So you have literally about 100 people who are barnstormers in the 20s and 30s, who then, some of those become teachers of the Tuskegee Airmen.
And the idea that you would look, at that point, you would look in the sky and see a plane, and it was a novel thing, and you'd wonder who was up there flying and realize it was a person of color.
Yep.
And in some cases, a woman of color.
Yep.
And that would blow people's minds.
Exactly. So for me, it was just an opportunity to sort of, what the Air and Space Museum taught me was, how do you take a history you love and make it accessible to the public? How do you take that history and give it meaning to a diverse audience? And so in some ways, it began to put me on that path that led me ultimately to the Air and Space Museum, to the American History Museum, to the African American Museum, and now because David Rubenstein twisted my arm, I am the Secretary of the Smithsonian.
So now we know how that happened. So we're here tonight to recognize you for the Records of Achievement Award, but I thought it would be interesting to talk about the roots of achievement and the roots of some of your leadership. And I think that there is a trip in particular, we've had a chance to talk about this before, a trip you took to Japan that I don't think a lot of people know about, but it seems like that really left an indelible imprint on you as a man and certainly as a leader. Can we talk a little bit about why were you sent to Japan? What were you doing?
So in the early 1990s, remember the Japanese economy was booming. And the Japanese came to the Smithsonian and said, we'd like to do a huge exhibition about American culture in Japan. Now their argument was that the 20th century was America's century, the 21st century would be Japan's century. So they wanted to sort of look at America as an artifact. And so there was this real desire, should the Smithsonian do it? And I thought, I don't know anything about Japan, although I took 1 week of Japanese language in 10th grade. And I realized that though this was an opportunity for me to learn. So I was put in charge of the team. I was the youngest person on the team. I was the only African American on the team. And we spent 3 years off and on negotiating with the Japanese, crafting an exhibition, working with diplomats from the United States and Japan. In essence, it taught me more about leadership than just about anything else. It taught me how to use a team. It taught me how to use a translator. But it taught me more than anything else that things that I thought everybody knew, I discovered maybe I only knew that. And it gave me the confidence to lead. And it was really, for a 3-year period, it ultimately became the first time the Smithsonian ever took significant artifacts around the world. We took an Apollo capsule. I took the Wright Flyer. And I remember the night everything was flying, I got a call from the then Secretary of the Smithsonian who said, are you flying on the plane? I said, I didn't plan on it. He said, be on the plane, because if it crashes, I want you on it. Yeah, that was a long, sleepless night.
So you were sent to Japan, and you spent a good deal of time there over 3 years. Your whole family did. You were young, relatively young,
Yep.
and you were a man of color. And this is not what the Japanese teams expected.
It took them probably 6 months before they would actually address me. They would always address somebody else on the team because they figured I couldn't be in charge. And then I made the mistake in their mind of putting women in charge. So it was really
And then
interesting.
they were like, oh, wait, where do I look now?
But the one thing that was so interesting is we wanted to tell the complicated story of America. And the Japanese pulled me aside, now this is after a year, and they said, we understand that you're black, therefore you hate America. therefore you're going to tell stories that are going to be embarrassing. And they used to always say, we Japanese want stories that are full of light. You want stories full of shadow. And it was really instructive to me to actually have to articulate why it was important to tell these difficult stories. And it was really, everything in Japan really, I think, prepared me for being able to articulate, being able to defend, be able to sort of work with different cultures. So for me, it was one of the great experiences of my career.
Shall we talk about the T-shirts?
So, because the Japanese, everything was very formal, and we'd have these negotiations. And my counterpart he was so old, he's probably 50, but we would debate, and at one point he got up and left. And I was negotiating with his number two, and I asked for certain things, and his number two said, no problem. Now, in Japanese, no problem is mondai nai. So he said, no problem. So I found out the next day that my counterpart just attacked the guy who said no problem, said, make those Americans work. Don't give them anything. Don't say no problem on anything. So what I did was I had T-shirts made that said the American Festival Smithsonian, but on the back it said mondai nai, no problem. And what it did is I then took the Americans every weekend on a trip to different parts of Japan, and the media began to cover us asking, where are the mondai nai Americans? And what happened is that was my subtle or not so subtle way of rubbing it in, but by the end of the project, my counterpart said, could he have a T-shirt? So it was really rare. And that was almost 30 years ago, and I still hear from them.
Wow. I hope you kept one of those T-shirts.
Oh, of course I do.
So as we move forward in your life, this is your life, Lonnie Bunch, as we move forward.
It's pretty scary.
When you took on the assignment for the National Museum of African American History and Culture, I'm curious about what your friends said to you.
People told me, literally, the chairman of the board of the Chicago History Museum basically said to me, you want to be the second person. You do not want to be the first person. The first person is going to fail. And I thought a lot about that, but I thought that being president of a museum in Chicago really nurtured my soul. But I thought if I could build this museum, it could nurture the soul of all my ancestors. And I never talked about ancestors until the moment I said yes to take that job. Never did, and it just clicked. And so for me, everybody told me it was a fool's errand, which is why I wrote the title of the book. But I also realized that when I thought about it and talked to my wife and family about it, is that everything I had done had prepared me for that. I had learned how to negotiate. I had worked in California and gotten beat up by Maxine Waters when she was the chair of the Budget Committee. So I was used to members of Congress beating me up. And that I learned that I had an ability to create a vision that people could see and believe. And so I said yes, but I have to be honest that as soon as I said yes, and they wanted to show me the new offices, which were going to be outside of the Smithsonian in L'Enfant Plaza. I went to the offices, and the offices were locked. And so I went downstairs and asked at the front desk, I'm the new director of the Smithsonian Museum. Can I have the keys to my office? They said, nope, we don't know who you are. So then I went to security. I figured, okay, let me go down to security. And I went down to security and said, look, I need to get into my office. And security said, we don't trust you, you're going to steal something. That's an empty office, we're going to steal something. So I'm standing there looking kind of foolish, and a guy goes by with a maintenance truck, and he had a crowbar. So I took the crowbar and broke in. And that's how we began the process. And that taught me that nobody was ready for it. I wasn't ready for it, the Smithsonian wasn't ready for it, but it taught me that I had to be as creative as I can be, bringing in more people to make this work. And that's how we're able to do it. So I still have that crowbar in my office.
Along with that picture that we saw.
That's right.
You have interesting things in your office.
Yep.
Who sustained you on that journey? I'm told that Maria was enthusiastic, that there were probably people that were whispering important things in your ear to keep going, because that hill was very steep at the beginning.
Well, part of my either weakness or strength is that I'm really good at 9 o'clock in the morning seeing the big picture, and by 10 o'clock focus on what I need to do. But there's no doubt, and I know guys say this all the time, but I would still be an assistant professor at University of Massachusetts without my wife. Because every time an opportunity came forward, I was scared. I'm like, do I leave this? Do I do that? And when it came to coming back for the museum, I was like, oh my God, we're happy in Chicago. We're living in Oak Park. I'm very pleased. And she just said, when do I pack? And that to me has been the great strength of this relationship, is that every time I was scared, and I gotta be honest, I get scared a lot, she would say, we can do this, and that allowed me to have the confidence to move forward. And then there were, really, I know I married above my station, so, but ultimately I think what happened is that people, you don't realize how many people you know, right? People would come up to me and say, you can do this. There were people, I'd walk down the street on 16th Street in Washington, D.C., and people would stop me and say, can I hug you? Because you're doing something really important. And so there was this kind of almost groundswell of support that every time I thought we couldn't do this or might not be successful, people would reach out and make me believe. And then, of course, there was nobody better than John Lewis. John Lewis introduced legislation to build this museum 17 times. And whenever I would go see John Lewis, he'd say, how are you doing? Forget anything else. How are you doing? What can I do to help? And so what I realized is that people all over the world wanted to help. And so our goal was to find ways to let them help. And that really was the key to the success, that let people help you, ask people to give you guidance, work with Congress, work with great philanthropists, and basically say, I believe we can do this. Believe in me, and we'll do something that the public didn't believe. And candidly, as I built the staff, that's what I would tell the staff. I'd say, people think you can't do this. People think you're going to fail. Let's show the world what we can do.
I understand why there is a Harvard Business School case study about your leadership. I encourage all of you, if you have not read A Fool's Errand, it should be on your bookshelf. It is a great read. It applies to so many things in life when you have to climb up the rough side of a mountain. But I want you to just briefly talk about the location. Because I don't know about anybody else, when you drive down the street, do you just find yourself looking at that building and saying, well played?
Well, I mean, there are two things. One was location.
Because they were going to put it in Suitland, right?
Well, there were thoughts about putting it in Anacostia, thoughts about putting it in a lot of places. But the notion was, Congress said, look, there are several sites, two I still can't find, but that in essence, you're going to have to make the argument about this. And so what was clear is that when you be able to put together a board that has Oprah Winfrey and Dick Parsons and Ken Chanel from American Express, they really helped me say it has to be on the mall. And we were able to convince the regents, and the regents were very supportive. Let's get this thing on the mall. And that was really crucial because we really felt that if the mall is where the world comes to understand what it means to be an American, then why not have this museum there so that people can see it within the context? And in some ways, the great strength of the Smithsonian is that we've got different portals into what it means to be an American. You can go to the Air and Space Museum and get that, or the Smithsonian Art Museum, or American History. And I thought that having this museum would really enrich that and give us more lenses into what it means to be an American. And I think, so getting the space was one, and then getting a building that looked a tad different was the other challenge. As you know, there are 17 regulatory agencies, and so part of it was trying to figure out which agencies cared about fancy architecture, which agencies cared about who we were going to serve. And so in essence, we began to figure out who I needed to play off of each other, and ultimately to get the approval to build a different museum.
We're talking to you at an interesting moment in a building that is so important to the preservation of our history and the full understanding of our democracy, talking to a man who has widened our aperture and better understanding this. But we're having this conversation at a moment where America is entering a period of willful amnesia. America has long been the home of the brave and the land of amnesia. We have a difficult time with our history. But right now, we are in a period of erasure. Do you have a word for us in terms of how individuals can deal with a moment like this. This is a room full of people who are here because they care about history.
I mean, I
it's
think your
full-time.
presence is so crucial. I mean, to help people understand that history is not something you run from because you can't run away from it. And that in essence, I've always argued that African American history is this amazing way to understand the possibilities of a nation. To say, here is a nation that has always been a work in progress. Here are stories that tell us not just of the difficult moments, but how people resolve those moments, how America is made better by grappling with these issues. For me, I always think, why run away from a history that is the most inspirational history I know? Why run away from people who believed in an America that didn't believe in them, but who always believed in the American notions in our founding documents? For me, what history really says is we are trying to be and get towards that more perfect union. But as Lincoln said, it's not a perfect union, it's a more perfect union. And to me, that's the goal of history, to help us understand that you've got the power, the obligation, the responsibility to help make a country better. History gives you guidance to figure out how to do that.
Can you tell us one last story? When you were looking for the things that you would place in the museum, it was truly brilliant to take the Antiques Roadshow approach, but you couldn't do that with everything you found. You couldn't exactly do that with the cabin where the enslaved family lived in Poolesville, Maryland. You couldn't do that with some of the vehicles. You couldn't do that, I don't know, with the mothership, which is in
Lord,
the,
everybody asked me about the mothership. I'm like, I didn't know what it was, but okay, I'll take credit.
You didn't know what the mothership was?
I did.
Okay, I was going to. We were going to have a conversation about that afterwards. Okay. But also with the remnants of the slave ship,
Yeah.
which came from the coast of South Africa, or Mozambique near South Africa. And then when you went to visit, they gave you a bag full of soil.
Yep. I mean, so I felt that it was really important to give people the remnants of a slave ship, to understand the international slave trade, not to create a fake ship or even find it, but to have relics that are part of the slave ship. And so I thought, how hard could that be? It took me years to find them. I looked for slave ships in Cuba, looked in slave ships off of Brazil, and I had to create a whole group of people who actually were maritime archaeologists. We trained people how to dive, how to find this material, but we couldn't find any. And then in the 90s, I used to teach in the summers in South Africa. And so some of those people were my students who now called me and said, we have a ship that might be a slave ship that sank off the coast of Cape Town. Can you bring your expertise to see if that's really the case? So I brought scholars and divers, and it turned out it was a ship called the São José that had left Lisbon in 1792, was on its way, went to Mozambique to pick up 512 people from the Makua tribe, was on its way back to the New World when it sank off the coast of Cape Town. So when we found the ship, I felt this real pull to go back to Mozambique, to see the Makua people. And when I went there, the chief said to me, well, two things happened. One is a young woman in her 20s comes up to me and says, I want to thank you for finding the ship because my ancestor was on that ship and we say his name every day. So I'm already thinking this is really very different. And then the chief says to me, I want to give you a gift. And he gives me a cowrie shell, a vessel wrapped in cowrie shells, and it's full of dirt. And I said, what is this? He said, my ancestors have asked that you take this soil and sprinkle it on the site of the wreck off Cape Town. So for the first time since 1792, my people can sleep in their own land. So I'm already I'm a bundle, a puddle of tears. And so we go to take it back, and it's this horrible day. The rain is horrible. We're going to get these boats out to dump the soil. We couldn't get it out. It was like the day the São José sank, all along the Cape of Storms. So we finally get some divers to swim out as far as they can, and they dump the soil over. And on all that's holy, as soon as the soil left the vessel, the sun came out. And I learned right then and there, don't mess with your ancestors. And so for me, that's why I tell people, this wasn't about building a museum. It was about building an institution that would allow us to remember, building an institution that would allow us to be made better, building an institution that would allow us to find understanding, truth, and maybe, just maybe, a little hope.
Don't mess with the ancestors. No. History is like a river. It moves in its own way, but I have always believed that history finds the right conservator, the person that will help carry it forward. And in you, our history, our shared history of our wonderful nation has found the right conservator in you.
Thank you.
And we are all the better for that.
You too, Kyle.
Congratulations. And thank you for sharing your story. Lonnie Bunch.